June 10th, 1942. Camp Cimahi, Java. The men inside were already ghosts. They moved through the suffocating heat with the hollowed-out motions of the damned, their frames shrinking daily inside the ragged uniforms of the defeated Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Just 3 months had passed since the surrender. 3 months since the world had ended on March 8th, 1942, when the promise of the Dutch Empire evaporated into the equatorial haze. The Japanese invasion had been swift, total, and merciless. Now its logic was being applied with chilling precision inside the barbed wire of Cimahi. The logic was simple. The logic was brutal. To the soldiers of the Dai Nippon Teikoku, surrender was an act of ultimate shame, a stain on the warrior's soul. Men who surrendered were not soldiers. They were not even men. They were less than nothing, and they deserved the nothingness that awaited them. Starvation was a tool. Disease was a tool. The rhythmic crack of a bamboo cane against a prisoner's back was a tool. All were instruments of a policy designed to grind humanity down to dust. 27-year-old Lieutenant Jan de Vries, a former engineer from Utrecht, documented it in a diary he kept on stolen scraps of paper. The entry for June 9th reads only, "Another gone. Dysentery. We are walking skeletons. They watch us and their eyes are glass." Nobody expected kindness, but rumors existed. Rumors always existed. Whispers in the latrines, faint as a fever dream. A guard in a distant camp who had slipped a prisoner a cigarette. A transport driver who had looked the other way. These were myths whispered to keep madness at bay. Hope was a dangerous contraband, far more perilous than a hidden photograph or stolen potato. Hope could get you killed. Hope was illogical. Then came the gesture. It was not a rumor. It was not a myth. It appeared at the morning roll call, a silent violation of the camp's unwritten laws. It was an object placed with impossible audacity where all could see it. Nobody saw who put it there. They whispered it was the Kempetai, the dreaded secret police setting a trap. A test of discipline. A new reason for a beating. Someone said it was a curse. Someone else said it was a mistake. But it was none of those things. The Dutch post-war debriefing reports filed under the bland heading Prisoner Morale Anomalies referred to it simply as the Cimahi Incident. The file notes a collective, inexplicable event that defied all eyewitness accounts and rational explanation. It was an act of profound, impossible compassion. It's an act that defied the brutal logic of their world. For over 50 years, the truth of that morning remained a mystery, a ghost story shared by the handful of survivors who made it home. It was a footnote in the grand, horrific history of the Pacific War. A gesture that made no sense. A gesture that defied all logic. This is the story of that gesture. It is the story of a decades-long search through faded diaries, classified military archives, and the fractured memories of old men, both Dutch and Japanese. It is the story of a hunt for a single moment of grace in a landscape of damnation, and for the enemy soldier who risked everything to deliver a message that should have been impossible. You are still human. February 27th, 1942. The Java Sea. It was an end. Not just an end, but a demolition. A final, convulsive shudder before the lights went out across the entire Dutch East Indies. Nobody on the ships of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command believed they could win. Not really, but they had to try. An order was an order. The fleet was a ghost fleet before a single shot was fired. A collection of relics and refugees sailing toward a technologically superior enemy. An enemy that moved with the speed and precision of a hunting shark. The sea was warm. A bathtub, a grave. Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, a Dutchman with a spine of steel and the terrible burden of command, knew the odds. His flagship, the light cruiser De Ruyter, felt small under the vast, indifferent sky. He had cruisers and destroyers, names that were once proud. Houston, Exeter, Perth, Java. They were patched up, tired, their crews exhausted from weeks of retreat. The Japanese had firepower, they had range. They had the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon so devastating, so far beyond anything the Allies possessed, it was like a myth, a deadly myth. Doorman gave the order, a famous order. Ik val aan, volg mij. I am attacking, follow me. He sailed them straight into the jaws of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Straight into oblivion. It was butchery. A sea battle that lasted 7 hours and decided the fate of an empire. A watery grave. The sea was lost, and with the sea, the island. The invasion began before the last Allied sailor drowned in the oil-slicked water. March 1st, 1942. A date seared into the memory of the colony. The landings were a textbook execution of military might. The Imperial Japanese Army's 16th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, came ashore in 3 places at once. Merak on the westernmost tip of Java, Eraton-Waitan farther east, Kragan on the northern coast. They came in the night, a silent, disciplined tide of men who had been fighting for years in China. They were hard men. They knew how to win. They expected to win. Against them stood the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL, a strange colonial force, a polyglot army of professionals and conscripts. There were the Dutchmen, the career officers and sergeants, pale in the tropical sun. There were the Eurasians, the Indos, caught between 2 worlds, fiercely loyal to a crown thousands of miles away. And there were the indigenous soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them. Ambonese, Menadonese, Javanese, Sundanese. Men who saw the KNIL as a path to status, a steady wage, an honorable life. Janssen, De Vries, Soprapto, Manuhutu. They wore the same uniform. They fought under the same tricolor flag. They were Dutch subjects, not Dutch citizens. A fine distinction. A fatal one. In total, about 85,000 men, a paper army. The collapse was immediate. It was total. The Japanese forces moved with a speed that defied logic, using bicycles to pour down the paved roads the Dutch had so carefully built. They bypassed strong points, flanked garrisons, sowed chaos. The KNIL, trained for colonial policing, not for total war against a first-rate power, disintegrated. Units were cut off. Communications failed. Rumors spread faster than the enemy. Rumors of paratroopers. Rumors of tanks where there were no tanks. Lieutenant General Hein ter Poorten, the KNIL's commander-in-chief, operated from his headquarters in the mountain city of Bandung. The city was supposed to be a fortress, a redoubt, a final stand. Bandung was a hope, a flimsy one. The reports that flooded his desk told a story of utter catastrophe. Buitenzorg, the governor's residence, fell. Then Batavia, the capital, was declared an open city to prevent its destruction. A stream of white-faced civilians and broken soldiers fled inland, clogging the roads to Bandung. The retreat was a rout. The Japanese were always one step ahead. Always. As if they knew the Dutch battle plan better than the Dutch themselves. Maybe they did. Maybe from spies. Maybe from collaborators. Maybe it just didn't matter. They were simply better. And then it was over. March 8th, 1942. Kali Jadi Airfield. The air was thick with humidity and humiliation. A photograph from that day shows the scene, stark and theatrical. General ter Poorten, a tall, stooped figure in a rumpled uniform, facing General Imamura. Imamura was composed, his uniform immaculate, a ceremonial sword at his side. The victor. He had demanded unconditional surrender. Ter Poorten had tried to negotiate, to salvage some scrap of dignity for his men, for his queen. Imamura was polite and immovable. The meeting was short. The document was signed. The Dutch East Indies, an empire that had stood for 300 years, ceased to exist in the scratch of a pen. Unconditional. The order went out by radio. Cease hostilities. Lay down your arms. The capture began. It wasn't a battle, it was a processing. Across the island, in barracks and makeshift assembly points, the soldiers of the KNIL and their allied comrades became prisoners. 93,000 KNIL personnel, 5,000 British, Australian, and American soldiers. All of them. They stacked their rifles, parked their trucks. They waited. The Japanese soldiers who guarded them were mostly silent, watching, observing. It was the silence that was the most terrifying. The silence of a world turned upside down. The silence of absolute power. They were marched to existing barracks, to camps, to schools, places with familiar names. Cimahi, Bandung, Batavia. The initial days were a blur of confusion, of roll calls, of administrative chaos. But it was an organized chaos, a purposeful chaos. The Japanese were not just conquerors, they were administrators, and they had plans. The folder, discovered years later in a Tokyo archive, was called Policy for the Disposition of Prisoners of War and Internees, Java Area. It was cold. It was bureaucratic. It was a death sentence written in neat columns. The whispers began almost immediately. The Japanese weren't just counting heads. They were sorting. A quiet, methodical process. Europeans were separated from Eurasians. Eurasians from indigenous. Officers from enlisted men. They had lists. Who knew they had lists? They knew names, ranks, political affiliations. They knew who were the engineers, the doctors, the railway specialists. How? How did they know so much? Someone said the pre-war Japanese consulate in Batavia was a spy nest. Someone else whispered about the Japanese photographers and barbers and merchants who had lived in the Indies for years. Listening, watching, waiting. The sorting had begun. A process of selection. For what? Nobody knew. Not yet. But the feeling was in the air, a metallic taste of fear. This was not just capture. This was acquisition. They were no longer soldiers. They were assets, human resources to be expended. And then the main thing started. September 23rd, 1943. Kin Siok, Thailand. They were not men anymore, they were numbers. In Japanese, a shouted sequence of sounds. Ichi, ni, san, shi. A roll call in the pre-dawn gloom, a tally of the living tools. The Dutchmen, once officers and engineers of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, were now simply Furio prisoners. A word spat out like a sour pit. They were less than men. They were property. The project had a name, a grand name, the Thai-Burma Railway. But the men who built it, the men who died on it, they called it something else. The Death Railway. 415 kilometers of steel laid through impossible jungle, a monument built of bones. Sergeant Willem de Vries, aged 32, formerly a civil engineer from Delft, knew the physics of it. He understood load-bearing stress, soil composition, the precise angle of a graded embankment. Now his knowledge was a curse. He knew exactly how wrong they were doing it. They used bamboo for scaffolding. They used hammers made of rock and wood. They moved tons of earth in woven baskets, one meager scoop at a time. A meter of track, another meter of track. Willem watched his men, his fellow Dutch, their bodies shrinking inside their uniforms. He saw the signs. Beriberi swelling their legs into grotesque water sacks. Dysentery hollowing them from the inside. Malaria shaking them with fevers that boiled the mind. A body was not a body, it was a delay. A problem to be disposed of. Quickly, the work ended. The camp began. A sketch exists. Drawn on a stolen scrap of paper by a man named Leo Jansen, a private who had been an architect's assistant in Batavia. The sketch, now yellowed and fragile in an archive in The Hague, shows the geometry of despair. A perfect rectangle of cleared jungle, enclosed by 3 layers of barbed wire. Watchtowers at each corner, manned by Korean guards who were often more brutal than the Japanese. The folder it's in is called Krijggevangenen Kampen, diverse Sektia e For. The sketch is labeled Kinsayok Number 3. It shows the long, palm-thatched barracks, the barakan, each one housing 200 men on tiered bamboo platforms. It shows the latrine, the benjo, a simple trench buzzing with flies. It shows the commandant's hut, set apart. And it shows the parade ground, the place of punishment, the place of tenko, the roll call. The daily routine was a litany of subjugation. 4 a.m., a guard shouting, banging a length of steel rail. Tenko! The sick were dragged out to be counted. Then the food. A small, sticky ball of rice. A watery soup, sometimes with a few weeds floating in it. Then the march to the railway line. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of labor. Felling trees, carving cuttings from solid rock, hauling sleepers. Under the sun. In the monsoon rain. Then the march back. Another tenko, another ball of rice. Then sleep, a brief, dreamless fall into exhaustion before it began again. And again. And again. Surveillance was total. It was a gas in the air. The Japanese officers, the Kempeitai secret police who would visit unannounced, the Korean guards. But worse, the whispers. They said some prisoners were informants, men broken by hunger, by disease, by the beatings. Men who would trade a name, a whispered complaint, for an extra spoonful of rice. A cigarette. Nobody knew for sure. But the fear was there. The fear poisoned everything. It made you watch your friends. It made you watch yourself. A misplaced look. A word spoken too loud. A gesture of defiance. Schneider, Bakker, van der Meer, Peters, de Jong. Names of men taken away in the night for such things. They never came back. And the radios. The radios were the ultimate sin. To the Japanese command, a radio was not a device. It was a weapon. It was a direct line to the enemy. A conduit for lies and propaganda that could poison the camp's fragile, brutal order. A memo intercepted after the war from the Southern Expeditionary Army Group headquarters in Singapore stated it clearly. The possession of any wireless receiving apparatus by a Furieux is an act of espionage. It is to be dealt with the utmost severity. Utmost severity. Two words that held a universe of pain. The Dutch had been clever. In the chaos of the surrender on Java, men had smuggled them. Small Phillips sets. Hidden in water canteens, in hollowed-out books, in the false bottoms of medical kits. In Kinsayok, it was said there was one. Just one. They called it De Geest. The ghost. It was a secret god in a biscuit tin, buried under the floorboards of Barrack 7. Its priests were a handful of officers who spoke English. Every few nights, they would risk everything. The generator's hum would mask the static. Ears pressed to a single shared earpiece. They listened. To the BBC, to the ABC from Australia, to Voice of America from San Francisco. The news was oxygen. It was proof that the world still existed beyond the wire. Stalingrad, the Allied landings in Italy, the bombing raids on Germany. Each piece of news was a victory, a tiny spark in the suffocating dark. It was memorized, broken down into whispers, passed from man to man during the morning, tenko, on the march over the clink of tools. Rome has fallen, a man might murmur while hauling a log. They're in Normandy, another might breathe while digging a ditch. It was the only thing that kept them human. It was the only reason they did not lie down and die. Then came the shakedown. It was always sudden. October 10th, 1943, an hour before dusk. The guards swarmed the camp, led by the commandant himself, a short, precise captain named Isamu Mori. No one knew why. Maybe a rumor from an informant. Maybe a careless word overheard. They tore the barracks apart, systematically, brutally. They ripped up floorboards. They emptied the meager packs. They smashed personal effects. They searched body cavities. The men stood outside, naked, watching the demolition of their tiny, pathetic world. The air grew thick with tension. Barrack 1, clear. Barrack 2, clear. They moved down the line. 3, 4, 5, 6. Then they reached Barrack 7. Willem de Vries stood shivering, not from cold. He watched them go straight for the third platform on the left. Straight for the loose floorboard. A guard pried it up, reached in, and pulled out the biscuit tin. Silence. A terrible, absolute silence fell over the entire camp. The guard stopped. The prisoners stopped breathing. Captain Maury walked over. He took the tin. He opened it, revealing the small Philips radio, its wires coiled like sleeping snakes. He looked at it for a long time. He looked up at the 200 naked, terrified men of Barrack 7. He looked at Willem de Vries, at Leo Janssen, at the 2 officers who operated it. Maury smiled, a small, thin smile, and then they brought out the wire. August 5th, 1944. Bondoang, Java. The silence was a weapon, a Japanese weapon. It was meant to sever, to isolate, to break the human spirit by convincing it that it was utterly alone. No letters from home, no news from the front, no word from a wife in the women's camp just 1,000 yards away. 1,000 yards that might as well have been 1,000,000 miles. The Geneva Convention was a forgotten whisper, a document from a dead world. The Kempeitai enforced the silence with beatings, with solitary confinement, with the casual cruelty of absolute power. No contact, no family, no world outside the wire. That was the rule. The absolute rule. But whispers traveled, like spores on the wind. They moved through the suffocating air of the barracks, passed from man to man on the work details, carried on the humid breeze that rustled the bamboo. Rumors of Allied landings. Rumors of defeats, rumors of hope. Nobody knew where they started. Maybe from a scrap of newspaper used to wrap fish in the market. Maybe from a covert radio, a crystal set built from stolen wire and a razor blade, hidden in the hollowed-out heel of a boot. Maybe from the Indonesian workers who moved in and out of the camp, their faces impassive masks that sometimes, just sometimes, broke into a flicker of a smile, a shared secret. The Japanese wanted silence, but the Dutch had learned to speak in shadows. Dr. Willem van der Meer, formerly of Utrecht's finest hospital, now the chief medical officer of Goos, understood this better than anyone. He knew that information was medicine. Hope was a nutrient more powerful than the watery rice gruel they were served. He watched men die of dysentery, of malaria, of beriberi, but he also saw them die of despair, a sickness of the soul. He needed a way to fight it, a way to punch a hole in the suffocating silence. A way to connect the men's camp to the women's camp, Camp Tideng, where his own wife, Annelies, and his 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, were held. And then there was Tammy. Tammy was a dog, a scruffy, unremarkable terrier mix, brown and white with one floppy ear. She had belonged to the camp commandant's family before the invasion. When the Dutch were interned, the dog was left behind, a stray that wandered between the newly erected fences belonging to no one and everyone. The Japanese guards ignored her. They saw a dog. Just a dog. A filthy, flea-bitten camp dog. They kicked at her sometimes. Sometimes they threw her a scrap. They did not see a courier. They did not see a lifeline. The idea was simple. So simple it was brilliant. It came from Sergeant de Vries, a wiry engineer from Rotterdam who could fix anything. He had seen Tammy nosing at the wire fence separating the camps, whining softly. She remembered the women and children. She remembered being petted. Her instincts pulled her from one group of familiar humans to another. The plan was born in a whispered conversation behind the latrines. De Vries, van der Meer, and a handful of others. Janssen, Bakker, Smit, de Jong. Names of a resistance cell armed not with guns, but with thread and paper. The first message was a test. A tiny piece of rice paper no bigger than a thumbnail. On it, Vandermeer wrote a single word in nearly microscopic script. Annalise. He rolled it impossibly tight, inserted it into a hollowed-out piece of bamboo the size of a matchstick, and sealed the ends with wax. De Vries then carefully stitched this tiny tube to the underside of Tammy's worn leather collar. It was invisible unless you were looking for it. Unless you knew. They waited until the afternoon shift change. When the guards were distracted, tired, thinking of their own food. Vandermeer knelt. He whispered to the dog, pointing through the wire. Go see Annalise. Go on, girl. Tammy, sensing the urgency, sensing the direction, trotted off. Not running, just a casual trot. Past the guard tower, past the board sentry. She squeezed under a loose section of the fence, a gap no man could pass through, and vanished into the women's camp. An hour passed, an eternity. Vandermeer cleaned his instruments. He lanced a boil on a young soldier's neck. He pretended to be calm. His hands did not shake. Years of surgical training, but his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Then a flicker of movement. Tammy, squeezing back under the wire. She trotted directly to him, tail wagging. He knelt, his fingers fumbling with the collar. The bamboo tube was still there, but there was something else. Tied to it with a single strand of human hair was another piece of paper, even smaller. He unrolled it with trembling fingers. 2 words. Willem, alive? That's how it began. The network grew. It became a fragile, vital artery of hope. Tammy made the trip too, sometimes 3 times a week, carrying messages in both directions. Names of the dead, names of the sick, requests for quinine, for salt, for a single word of love. A list of those who had died in the men's camp, so the women would not hold on to false hope. A list of newborns in the women's camp, a defiant proclamation of life in the face of death. A tiny, fragile gesture, a gesture of hope. In a hidden diary recovered years later from a buried biscuit tin, a man named Sergeant Peter Groot drew it. A crude sketch, pencil on stolen paper. It showed a small, scruffy dog slipping between 2 fences of barbed wire. A guard tower loomed in the background, the soldier in it a careless stick figure. The dog had a tiny packet tied to its collar. Underneath, Groot had written, De Bode van Bandung. The courier of Bandung. The sketch was a symbol of everything they fought for. Not with bullets, but with ingenuity. With courage, with a dog. But the system was fragile. It relied on boredom. It relied on the Japanese seeing only what they expected to see. A dog. Just a dog. Then in late July, a new officer arrived, Sergeant Tanaka. He was not from the regular army. He was Kemputai, a professional. His eyes missed nothing. He was young, ambitious, with a gaze that seemed to strip everything down to its component parts. He watched the prisoners. He watched the guards. He watched the camp dog. On the afternoon of August 5th, Tammy was sent with a crucial message. It was more than a list of names. It contained a warning from a sympathetic Javanese kitchen worker about an impending shakedown. A search for radios, for diaries, for contraband. For hope. Vandermeer watched from the shadow of the infirmary, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Tammy trotted towards the fence. Sergeant Tanaka was standing there. He did not kick at the dog. He did not ignore it. He watched it. He tilted his head. A flicker of something. Curiosity. He called out in Japanese. Tammy, friendly to anyone who showed her kindness, trotted over to him, wagging her tail. Tanaka knelt. He stroked the dog's head, and then his hand moved slowly, deliberately to her collar. He ran his fingers along the worn leather. Once, twice. Then he stopped. His fingers had found the small, hard lump of the bamboo tube. Vandermeer froze. Time itself seemed to stop. The heat, the flies, the distant shouts, it all faded away. There was only the Japanese sergeant, the trusting dog, and the tiny secret that could unravel everything. Tanaka's fingers closed around the tube. One man's curiosity, the end of everything. Inside the tiny bamboo tube was more than a warning. It was a list of names. The names of every man involved in the communication network. Janssen, Bakker, Smit, de Jong. And at the very top, the name of the man who organized it all. Dr. Willem van der Meer. January 12th, 1944. Bandoang, Java. A man's life was worth less than a bowl of rice, less than a bullet. In the Kenpitai camps, a man's life was worth nothing at all. It was a debt, a negative balance to be paid in pain. And the Kenpitai were the collectors. Always the collectors. Henri Hecking knew this. As a medical officer, he cataloged death in all its forms. Beriberi, dysentery, malaria, starvation. He recorded the slow, inexorable subtraction of life. But the Kenpitai were different. They were not a disease. They were a certainty. An executioner's blade disguised as a military police force. To fall into their hands was to be erased. Completely. Then the rumors started. Whispers in the latrine lines. Hissed conversations in the dark of the barracks. A Japanese officer was down, wounded, not just any officer. A Kenpeitai officer. They said it was an accident. A jeep overturned on the muddy road from Chimahi. Others whispered of an attack, a lone guerrilla with a stolen rifle. Nobody knew. But the result was the same. The man was dying. And his name was Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe. The guards came for Hecking at midday. No explanation. Just two soldiers, their bayonets fixed, their faces impassive. They marched him past the skeletal figures of his fellow prisoners. Their eyes followed him, some with pity, most with a cold, hard curiosity. Another one gone, another name to be crossed off the list. They marched him not to the interrogation huts, not to the execution post, but to the Japanese officers' quarters. A place no prisoner ever saw. Not and lived to tell about it. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the sweet, cloying odor of sake. Several Japanese officers stood around a low cot, silent, tense. On the cot lay Watanabe. His uniform was shredded, his leg a mangled ruin of bone and flesh. It was already turning a dark, putrid green. Gangrene. Hecking could smell it from the door. A smell he knew better than his own name. The smell of imminent death. An interpreter stepped forward, a short, nervous man. "You are doctor." It was a statement, not a question. Hecking nodded. "You will fix him." Hecking looked at the leg. It was not a wound to be fixed. It was a bomb that had already detonated. The infection was raging, poisoning Watanabe's blood with every beat of his heart. There was only one chance. A desperate one. Amputation. Here. Now. With what tools? A kitchen knife? A wood saw? It was impossible. It was a death sentence. For Watanabe. And for Hecking when he failed. "I have no instruments," Hecking said, his voice a dry rasp. "No anesthetic, no sterile supplies." The interpreter conferred with another officer, a major with a cold scar across his cheek. The major barked an order. A soldier returned with a small wooden box. Hecking's old medical kit, confiscated months ago. He opened it. A scalpel, a few clamps, a bone saw with rust spots on the blade, some iodine, a handful of sulfonamide tablets. It was a mockery of a surgeon's arsenal. This was not a request for medical aid, it was a test. A cruel piece of theater. He was Kenpeitai, a butcher, a torturer. Hecking had seen the men Watanabe's unit had finished with. Men with no fingernails, with broken limbs, with minds shattered beyond repair. To save him was a betrayal of every man who had suffered at his hands. To refuse was suicide. The prisoners outside knew. They had to know. The word would spread like a fever. Hecking, the Dutch doctor, saving the Kenpeitai monster. He would become a pariah, a collaborator, less than a man. He looked at Watanabe's face, pale and beaded with sweat, his breathing shallow. He was not a monster in that moment, just a man. A dying man. Hecking thought of his oath. The oath he had taken in a clean, bright lecture hall in Amsterdam, a world away. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. What did that mean here? Where harm was the very air they breathed. He made the choice. Boil water. Hecking commanded the interpreter, his voice suddenly firm. And bring me your sharpest knives and all the sake you have. For the next 2 hours, the room became an operating theater from hell. Hecking worked with a frantic, focused intensity. He poured the raw alcohol into the wound. Watanabe screamed, a thin animal sound, before passing out. Good. Hecking used the sulfonamide tablets, crushing them into a powder to pack the stump. He used the rusty saw. The sound of it grating against bone was the only sound in the room. Saw, cut, clamp, tie. He stitched the flesh with thread pulled from a Japanese uniform. He worked without thinking, his hands moving with a memory of their own. He was not a prisoner. He was not a hero or a traitor. He was a surgeon, a doctor. That is all. When it was over, he stood up, his body drenched in sweat and blood. Watanabe was alive. Barely. His breathing was a faint flutter. The Japanese officers stared, their faces unreadable. The major with the scar looked from Watanabe to Hecking, then back again. He gave a curt nod. The guards took Hecking by the arms. They did not take him back to the main barracks. They put him in a solitary confinement hut. A wooden cage. For 3 days he was alone. He waited for the bullet. He knew Watanabe would die. The infection was too severe. And then they would come for him. The whispers from the other prisoners would have reached the guards. The collaborator who failed, his fate was sealed. He had gambled everything on a dead man. On the 4th day, the door opened. It was not a guard with a rifle, it was the interpreter. He carried a small tray. On it was a bowl of clean rice, a piece of fish, and a metal cup of water. He placed it on the floor. Watanabe-sama lives, the interpreter said, his voice holding a new note. Respect. He asked for you. They did not execute him. They did not praise him. They gave him a new job. Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, recovering against all odds, issued a decree. Dr. Hecking was to be assigned to the camp infirmary. He was given a small supply of quinine, a box of bandages, and 3 precious vials of morphine. It was a pittance, a drop of water in a desert of suffering. But it was more than they had seen in 2 years. It was a chance. Hecking walked into the long, dark hut that served as a hospital. The men inside, the ghosts of Chimai and the skeletons of the railway, turned their heads. Their eyes were not grateful. They were full of contempt, full of hate. He had saved one of them, the worst of them. And in doing so, he had saved himself. To these men, he was no longer a fellow prisoner. He was something else, something unclean. He had found his salvation, and it had cost him everything. January 12th, 1944. Bandoang, Java. A man's life was worth less than a bowl of rice, less than a bullet. In the Kenpitai camps, a man's life was worth nothing at all. It was a debt, an unpayable debt for the crime of being the enemy. The guards were the collectors. They extracted payment in flesh, in dignity, in hope. Their cruelty was a uniform, worn every day, polished with routine, until it became a second skin. But skin can crack. It started with whispers. Rumors traded for a sliver of stolen soap, for a thread to mend a rotten shirt. A man in Hut Block 4 swore he saw it, saw a guard turn his back. Just for a second. A calculated second, long enough for a note to pass from one skeletal hand to another. Nobody believed him. It was delirium. It was the fever. Hope is a symptom of the dying. But then it happened again. His name was Sergeant Mori, a squat man from a fishing village, or so they said. His face was a mask of perpetual disapproval. His bamboo stick, the Saitama Express, the prisoners called it, was never far from his hand. He was a creature of the system, a cog in the great grinding machine of the camp. But Maury had a tell, a tick. Before the morning roll call, the dreaded tenko, he would inspect the water barrels. He would always walk the same path, always. From the kitchens, past the infirmary, to the parade ground, and he would always look left, only left. The men in Hut Block 6 learned this. They learned it the hard way. They learned it through observation, the way a hunter learns the habits of a dangerous animal. The space on Maury's right side for about 10 paces was a blind spot, a pocket of invisibility, a tiny, fleeting sanctuary. It became the camp's secret post office. Notes, scraps of news, a stolen word from a smuggled newspaper all passed in that 10-pace window, all under the unseeing eyes of Sergeant Maury. He never looked right, not once. Was it deliberate? A post-war report, document NIOD 7X4B, contains the interrogation of a former Bandung prisoner, a Dutch engineer named Frans de Groot. He stated, "We all knew about Maury's walk. We called it the Angel's Path. To believe he didn't know, it's impossible. A man that precise, that rigid. He knew. He had to know." The transcript of Maury's own interrogation is missing. Lost, they said, probably burned in the chaos after the surrender. Maybe it was never written down at all. Then there was the food. It was not food. It was a calculated insult, a watery gruel the color of dishwater, with a few stray grains of rice floating like ghosts. Barely enough to sustain the slow process of dying. The men who served it were prisoners themselves, but the guards watched. They always watched. Spoonfuls were measured by the eye. A little too much and the server would pay. A beating, no food for a day, or worse. But Guard Corporal Tanaka was different. He was young, maybe 20. His uniform always seemed too big for his thin frame. They said he was a student. From Kyoto. A poet, some whispered. He had delicate hands, not the calloused fists of the others. Tanaka was assigned to the kitchen detail. He watched the PAP being served, and he never used a stick. He used his eyes. A prisoner, an Australian private named Kevin O'Connell, was dying of dysentery. He was just a boy. Younger than Tanaka. He couldn't keep the pap down. His friends, propping him up in the food line, would beg for just the watery part. The broth. Easier to swallow. One day, Tanaka was supervising. O'Connell's friend, a man named Harris, made the request. The prisoner server froze, looking at Tanaka, expecting the inevitable explosion, the violence. Tanaka just nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of his chin. Just a nod. Nothing more. From that day on, when Tanaka was on duty, a small network of signals would ripple through the line. A cough. A hand placed on a shoulder. It meant a man was sick. Very sick. And on those days, the ladle would move differently. The server, emboldened by that one silent gesture, would skim the thinnest part of the gruel. For O'Connell, for Davies, for Schmidt, for the men who were fading. It was a small mercy. A cup of water in a burning house, but it was a mercy. It was humanity, in a place that had outlawed it. These were not grand acts of rebellion. They were not Shakespearean dramas of conscience. They were smaller, subtler, the size of a grain of rice, the length of a turned head. A sketch exists, found tucked into the spine of a tattered Bible after the liberation. It was drawn with charcoal on a piece of packing paper. It shows a Japanese guard, his back to the viewer, standing by a fence. In the foreground, one prisoner's hand slips a tiny, folded square of paper into another's. The artist is unknown. The folder in the archives is just labeled Camp Art, Java. The caption, scrawled in faint Dutch, reads, "The Blind Sentry." The most dangerous gestures involved the Kenpitai, the secret police. They were the true monsters, the ones who haunted the nightmares of guards and prisoners alike. To cross the Kenpitai was not just to risk a beating, it was to risk erasure. Disappearance into the concrete cells, coises of their headquarters on Bandoang's Bragaweg, a place from which no one returned whole. Yet, even there, even in the heart of the abyss, they brought in a Dutch priest, Father Jansen, accused of running a message network. The accusation was true. He was old, maybe 65, with eyes that had seen too much but were not afraid. They put him in the charge of a young Kenpai-Tai officer, Lieutenant Ishida. Ishida was an intellectual, spoke flawless German. He was supposed to break Jansen, interrogate him, find the names. The interrogation file, KMP BDO CNIT 1138, is clinical. It records a week of questioning. No food, no water, no sleep. Standard procedure. But the guard's unofficial logbook, discovered later, tells another story. 3 words written on the 3rd day next to Ishida's name. Mizu o Atata. He gave water. A crime. A capital crime. On the 5th day, Johnson collapsed. The log says Ishida requested a doctor. The request was denied. That night, a prison orderly, a Javanese man named Basuki, was cleaning the hallway. In his testimony given in 1946, he said he saw Lieutenant Ishida standing outside Johnson's cell. Just standing, for almost an hour. Then, Ishida walked to a supply closet. He came back. He knelt by the slot in Johnson's cell door, a tiny opening for passing bowls of filth. Basuki saw the lieutenant's hand push something through. Something small. He heard a faint click as it hit the stone floor. Ishida got up and walked away. He did not look back. The next morning, Father Janssen was dead. The official cause was heart failure. But when they removed his body, another prisoner tasked with the grim duty found it. Clenched in the old priest's hand, a single white tablet. Quinine. Useless for a failing heart. But a symbol. A final, impossible gesture. Ishida was transferred to the Burmese front a week later. A promotion, they called it. The men who knew, the few who understood the secret language of small kindnesses, knew better. It was a punishment. A quiet execution. He was being sent to die. For a sip of water. For a single pill. For a moment when he chose to be a man instead of a uniform. January 12th, 1944. Bandoang, Java. A man's life was worth less than a bowl of rice. Less than a bullet. In the Kenpai-Tai camps, a man's life was worth nothing at all. It was a debt. A debt inscribed on the day of surrender. A debt to be paid with pain, with humiliation, with endless back-breaking labor under a sun that did not forgive. The logic of the camp was a closed, perfect system of debasement. It was designed to prove a single, terrible fact. You are not human. You are not Dutch or British or American. You are a number, a ghost, an asset to be expended. The system was absolute. It was unbreakable until it was broken. It was never broken with force. Not with a riot or an escape. It was broken with a gesture, a thing so small it could be held in a closed fist, a whisper, a glance. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of heresy against the camp's brutalist creed. They were symbols. In the absolute darkness of Bandoang, a symbol was more dangerous than a weapon. It was a light, a tiny, flickering pinprick that proved the darkness was not, in fact, absolute. A note folded 16 times until it was the size of a thumbnail passed from a Javanese kitchen worker to a Dutch doctor. A single crudely drawn flower on a scrap of stolen paper. These things defied the harsh logic of captivity. They were not transactions for survival. They were transmissions of humanity. The folder in the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation is labeled simply Bandung Covert Communications. It is thin. Most of the evidence did not survive. It was eaten or burned or it disintegrated in the tropical humidity. But the testimony remains. They talk about the notes. Captain Hendrik van der Meer, Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, describes it in a debriefing dated November 19, 1945. He was a doctor in the camp hospital, a place of organized dying. He had no quinine, no bandages, no antiseptic. Men died of dysentery, of malaria, of simple infections. They died because they were worth nothing. One day, a Javanese orderly, a man named Superman, a boy really, no more than 20, slipped him a small, hard lump inside his meager rice portion. It was a piece of cinchona bark, raw quinine. Not enough to cure a man, but enough to quell a fever for a day. Enough to grant a moment of clarity, a moment of hope. It was more than medicine. It was a promise. Superman said nothing. He never looked at Vandermeer. To look was to be seen. To be seen was to be beaten, to be tortured, to be killed. The entire transaction happened in the periphery. A ghost giving life to another ghost. The act was a symbol, a pair of clasped hands bridging the enmity enforced by the Japanese. One hand, the giver's, was a declaration that the prisoner was still a man, worthy of compassion. The other, the receiver's, was a confirmation that he had not been forgotten by the world outside the wire. This was the psychological sustenance. It was not the bark that kept Vandermeer alive. It was the knowledge that kindness still existed, that a stranger would risk death for him, for nothing. This was the currency of the damned. Not money, not food, not privilege. It was a shared secret, a moment of defiance against the narrative of hatred. Rumors circulated in hushed tones, in the latrine pits, on the forced marches. Whispers of a Korean guard, maybe his name was Kim, or possibly Kaneda, who would accidentally drop a cigarette near a work party. Of a local woman who left a single banana on a fence post along the road to the quarry. Day after day. These were not random acts. They were a language, a symbolic dialogue that screamed a single message into the suffocating silence. We see you. We see your humanity. The art they made, the few scraps that survived, is filled with it. Not grand battles or portraits of generals, but small things. A sketch of a bird, wings outstretched, flying over a strand of barbed wire. A drawing of a single candle, its flame pushing back an oppressive, inky blackness. These were not just doodles to pass the time. They were icons. They were prayers. They were visualizations of the hope they received in those fleeting secret exchanges. The light in the darkness was not an abstract concept. It was the memory of Superman's hand. It was the afterimage of a dropped cigarette. It was the taste of a stolen banana. Sergeant Miles McGregor, Royal Artillery, later tried to explain it to an interviewer who could not understand. It wasn't about the food, you see, he said, his voice raspy on the old recording. It was proof that we weren't forgotten, that God, or whatever you want to call it, you hadn't packed up and gone home. But symbols are a double-edged sword. A light can be seen by your friends. It can also be seen by your enemies. In late February 1944, during a surprise inspection, a Kenpeitai sergeant, a man named Kudo, found one of the drawings. It was hidden in the lining of a worn-out boot belonging to Corporal Thomas Finch, a 22-year-old from Liverpool. The drawing was simple, primitive. Two hands, one skeletal and white, the other strong and brown, clasped together, bridging the gap, bridging the enmity. Kudo, a man known for his casual brutality, a man who had broken bones for a misplaced look, did not fly into a rage. He simply stood there, looking at the scrap of paper. He understood the language perfectly. He understood the heresy. It was a direct contradiction of everything the camp was meant to be, of everything he was meant to enforce. It was a statement that his power, the Emperor's power, was not total. That another law was in effect. The law of human decency. He folded the paper carefully, put it in his tunic pocket, and then he called for Finch, and for the camp commandant. The whole barracks fell silent. They knew what they had just seen. A symbol of hope had just become a death warrant. August 15th, 2023. The Braunbeek Museum, Arnhem. History is not dead here. It breathes. It sweats from the walls a faint, humid memory of the Indies. They say time heals all wounds. A lie. A comfortable, dangerous lie. Time does not heal, it buries. And sometimes we must dig. The files are filled with monsters, with sadists, with men who became machines of cruelty. Kempeitai interrogators, camp commandants, guards whose names were spat like curses for 50 years. Yamamoto, Okada, Watanabe. A litany of pain. It is an easy story to tell. The story of absolute evil. It is clean. It is simple. But it is not the whole truth. And the truth is never clean. There was another file. It was not in the main archive. It was kept separately, in a plain cardboard box marked incongruities. A strange, sterile word. Inside, scraps of paper. Post-war testimonies, letters, diary pages that did not fit the narrative. They were the anomalies, the glitches in the system of hatred. A letter from Peter van der Meer, former KNIL Fusilier, dated 1964. He speaks of a guard at the Changi prison. A corporal. He never learned his name. The corporal was young, maybe 19. He had a nervous cough, and one night, during a dysentery outbreak, he slipped a small bottle of boiled water through the bars to a dying Dutchman. He said nothing, he just looked away. As if ashamed, an act of treason, an act of humanity. The bottle was a bomb that could have destroyed them both. Nobody wanted to hear these stories in 1946. Or in 1956, Holland was rebuilding, and healing required a clear enemy, a unified front of righteous anger. To suggest a Japanese soldier could be kind was a form of betrayal. It muddied the waters. It complicated the perfect, terrible clarity of victim and perpetrator. So the stories were whispered. They were told in hushed tones between survivors who trusted each other. Do you remember the one at the bridge camp? The older one, with the glasses? He let me keep my wife's photograph. The guard at Chimahi who looked the other way when my mother smuggled me a piece of bread. They were secrets, secrets of kindness, more dangerous in some ways than secrets of brutality. Brutality was expected. Kindness was an aberration, an impossibility. The official reconciliation began decades later. A clumsy, painful process. The emperor's visit, the apologies, the financial reparations. Politics. It was all politics. But the real reconciliation was happening elsewhere. On a smaller scale, in letters that took months to cross the ocean. An old Dutch sailor writing to a Japanese newspaper trying to find the family of a medic who treated his malaria on the Burma Railway. A Japanese student on a scholarship in Leiden, visiting the Indies Monument on his own, standing in the rain. Quietly. Alone. He was born in 1998. He knew nothing of the war, but he knew the silence. The silence of his grandfather. You see it in the sketches. Not the famous ones, the ones showing emaciated bodies and beatings. There are others. An artist named Willem Ackerman, a survivor of the Pekanbaru Railway, drew them from memory in the 70s. He never showed them to anyone but his son. After his death, they were found in a shoebox. A crude charcoal drawing of a Japanese engineer sharing his tiny lunch ration with a Dutch prisoner. The caption reads, Ishikawa-san. He said I reminded him of his brother. Another shows a guard, his face turned away, leaving a mango on a tree stump near the prisoner's path. Small acts, tiny sparks in an ocean of darkness. They do not illuminate the whole ocean. They do not make the darkness less absolute. But they prove that the sparks were there. They were always there. History is not a monument. It is a mosaic, made of 1,000,000 broken pieces. Most are dark, stained with blood, with misery, with suffering. The camps, the death marches, the executions, the numbers are undeniable. 35,000 Dutch prisoners of war, an 82% mortality rate on the Burma Railway. Facts. Facts are always truthful, but scattered among the dark tiles are others. Lighter ones, a bottle of clean water, a shared cigarette, a photograph not confiscated. A blind eye turned. They do not change the picture. They do not excuse the horror. They make it human. terribly complicatedly human. It is the legacy, not the treaties or the trade agreements. This. This understanding that the monolith of the enemy was a fiction, a useful wartime fiction. The reality was messier. It was a collection of individuals, farmers, fishermen, students, clerks, dressed in uniforms and taught to hate. Some learned their lessons well. Others failed. They failed to be monsters. They remembered they were men. The final report was never written. There is no conclusion. How can you conclude a story that is still being told in the quiet grief of a grandson, in the recovered memory of a 90-year-old man, in a charcoal sketch found in a dusty attic? The narrative of suffering is complete. It is a closed circle of pain. But the narrative of humanity, it is a broken line, an ellipsis, a question mark hanging in the air over the graves and the memorials, a whisper that says the war was not the only story, not the whole story. And in that whisper, maybe, is the beginning of peace. Not forgiveness. Something harder. Something more honest. A memory. Whole and unbroken. In the brutal arithmetic of war, where does one place an act that has no equation? What happens to the clean lines of history when a single gesture defies all logic, leaving behind not a conclusion but a permanent, haunting question? The story of the Banduang camp does not end with liberation or surrender. It ends in silence. It ends with a mystery that official records cannot contain and that memory itself struggles to process. The truth remained somewhere between the lines, between archival files, between the ghosts of men who were taught to hate. The facts are brittle like old bones. Document NEOD 774B contains the interrogation of Frans de Groot, a Dutch engineer whose mind cataloged the horror, but also this single, stark anomaly. A gift, an offering from the captors. From the very men who enforced starvation as policy, who wielded bamboo canes with methodical cruelty, who saw the Dutchmen not as officers and engineers, but as furio, a status lower than human. They were the arbiters of a slow death, moving through the suffocating heat with the detached efficiency of fate itself. They represented an empire that demanded a debt of humiliation from all who surrendered. And yet, for one moment the machinery stopped. Was it the bottle of boiled water slipped to a dying man during the dysentery outbreak? Was it the silent summons to the officers' quarters that ended not in a beating, but in a shared, inexplicable stillness? The survivors' accounts diverge. They speak in whispers, their words clouded by decades of trauma and the sheer impossibility of the event. It was not compassion as we know it. It was not friendship. It was not a change of heart. It was a rupture, a tear in the fabric of their prescribed reality. One moment they were the damned, their frames shrinking inside ragged uniforms. The next, they were witnesses to an act that belonged to another world. History loves clean narratives. It loves victors and vanquished, heroes and villains. But this gesture fits nowhere. It was a debt paid by those who held all the power to those who had nothing left to lose. It was an acknowledgement that transcended the code of Bushido and the desperation of the prisoner. The conqueror and the conquered, for a single instant, ceased to be. They were merely men, trapped together under a sun that did not forgive, bound by a shared mortality that no imperial decree could erase. This was the true defiance. Not a rebellion of prisoners, but a rebellion of the human spirit against the role it was forced to play. A rebellion against logic. We are left with fragments. We are left with the silence of the captors who returned to Japan and never spoke of it. We are left with the bewildered testimony of the Dutchmen who could never reconcile the daily brutality with the impossible gift. Perhaps the search for a concrete reason is the ultimate mistake. Perhaps the gesture was not an answer, but a question in itself. A question posed in the universal language of a shared glance, a quiet offering, a moment of profound and unnerving recognition. It asks if the roles we play in war are the entirety of who we are. It asks if, even in the deepest abyss of organized hatred, a flicker of something else can persist. Not forgiveness, not redemption. Something more fundamental. The numbers tell one story. The real story is in the transformations, in how enemies, for a fleeting second, can cease to be enemies. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The guards faded back into a defeated nation. But the question posed by that gesture in the suffocating heat of Java remains, echoing louder than any battle cry. It is the final, unsettling legacy of their shared ordeal. An enemy is a story you have not yet heard. But what do you call him after he has looked into the depths of your despair and, for one inexplicable moment, chosen to see a man?